Hello and welcome to my channel Polyglot Reading. This is a new video from the series Backwards Through the Galaxy. It's a project together with Mitch from the German channel, the Pringle 100 project where we read in reverse order all the books of David Pringle's list of the 100 best science fiction novels. Today I'm going to present the novel The Birth of the People's Republic of Antarctica by John Calvin Batchelor. Okay, how to start? This is a very special video because it is the first video on my channel where I do a slating, a real hatchet job on a novel. And it is a video about a book that I did not finish, a book that I simply cannot recommend. And when I started my channel, I planned never to spend time on doing slantings or hatchet jobs on books, nor to talk about books I did not finish. But reality has taught me that for the purpose of this series, I need to make some exemptions because we decided to talk about each book of the series. So I also have to talk about the ones that I DNF'd and didn't like. Okay, so this video will have two parts. Part one is for those of you who are only interested in the short answer, a concise summary of what the book is about, I say a little bit about the plot, and why I wasn't willing to invest more of my precious lifetime into reading it until the end. And so for those of you who want to know a little bit more, I'll add a second part in where I describe the promising and inventive beginning of the novel, some of the fancy constellation of characters, and a few thematic and narrative strengths of the novel. I will highlight that in a little bit more detail. But then I also explain in more detail my reason for DNFing this book, and finally, sort of a conciliatory gesture. I list a few ideas and quotes of the books that surprised me in a positive way, so that I still consider worth mentioning or worth remembering. So this is a free giveaway for you, a few gems, literary gems that you can enjoy without having to read the tedious parts of the book. Okay, starting with part number one. Okay, the plot. The novel is about a group of refugees who have to flee from political unrest in Sweden on a ship with the illustrious name Angel of Death. And some of them have to flee because they committed a couple of crimes, and they flee under the leadership of a young man named Grim Fiddle and his grandfather, a choleric Lutheran pastor. And on their sea voyage through the Atlantic, they get caught up in other political turmoil, which by and by indicates and tells them that there must have been some political upheaval and the pandemic situation at the global scale, not only in Sweden. So things have, the total global political situation has changed, and now everywhere, at the sea and on land, the law of the jungle is in force. And so they get caught up in some brutal battles over the Falkland Islands, and they pick up other refugees, and along the way then they settle on an island in the Southern Ocean, an island called Southern Georgia, an island that really exists. And there they try to establish a sort of a functioning dwarf state. But this strange and small society is threatened by both natural disasters but also internal intrigue, and which ultimately brings out the darkest and most cruel sides of the human character and human nature. In my view, the book has the following weaknesses. First of all, there's a very original constellation of characters, but this constellation and the very fancy initial situation, they go far beyond the author's literary abilities in turning this into a captivating novel. He just can't handle this stuff. I think he's just too inexperienced as a writer, and to transform this into a captivating novel of an adequate length. And the second point is that a plethora of characters that are introduced who are completely inadequately described and characterized, and their narrative function remains completely unclear, and this really confuses the reader, even the most willing one. And the author simply can't write dialogue. Their dialogues come across as clunky, clumsy, stilted, unnatural, you name it. It is totally unrealistic that the people in the situation described, they could have talked to each other in the way the dialogues are written. Many dialogues do not show any sensible sequence of statements, so that are really referring to each other in a meaningful way. And it's obvious that the author uses dialogues to convey to the reader certain opinions and pieces of information, and just to have some change. He then uses dialogue, but they don't work as dialogues. And furthermore, the number of characters is overwhelmingly large, and for no reason. So the book would really benefit from cutting half the number of characters, and even many of the key characters, of the main characters, are described insufficiently. So, and in particular, quite important character changes occur completely unexpectedly. They are not introduced in a comprehensible way, and but they are also not explained subsequently. I think it could work as a literary feature to introduce this unexplained sudden character changes, but then there should be some explanation at some point after that, and this doesn't happen. And then there's just an overload of mythological and religious connotations in the characters, their names and their character traits. On the first few pages, that reads as an interesting gimmick, that most of the characters have either names from the Bible or from ancient mythologies, such as Israel, Lazarus, Cleopatra, or speaking names such as Peregrine or Charity. But this quickly becomes too much, annoying and tiring at some point. It's just too much. And then the novel contains also really tedious theoretical treatises that have no clear narrative function. My impression is that the author either wants to show off his erudition and learnedness here, or he simply does not understand that it makes no sense to integrate into the novel each and any topic and thought that had accidentally crossed your mind during the month you're writing on a novel. So I'm missing sort of filter function in the author's brain. A small example, in the very first chapter, there's a section of about 15 pages in which the so-called concept of utilitarianism is explained. And so this is concept of moral philosophy that can be defined in 2.5 sentences. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states that an action is morally right if it produces the greatest possible well-being or happiness for the greatest possible number of individuals. So that means utilitarianism judges actions solely by their consequences and not by their intentions or intrinsic qualities or their compliance with overarching moral rules. So, and utilitarianism places the happiness and well-being of the masses above the consequences of an action for a single individual. So it's a sort of a quantitative approach to morals. So 2 or 3 sentences, done. But 15 pages in a novel, not in a philosophy textbook, really. So if you really want to make a point about utilitarianism, and you might be tempted also to introduce the most important counter concept, the so-called deontological ethics. And these are ethical concepts that determine the moral status of an action, not primarily based on its consequences, but on the basis of whether it is in accordance with overarching moral rules. And yeah, so deontologists therefore judge an action primarily by its intention, by its conformity to rules, not by its consequences. So this is for sure a fascinating topic that can also be dealt with well in literature and in novel. And it makes sense to briefly introduce these 2 concepts. 4, 5 sentences, great, but 15 pages, really. Just a small example, a quote from the text. Utilitarianism in its many aspects, act, rule, universal, ideal, etc., hair splittings, is said to be best not as a descriptive ethics, but as a normative ethics. It whispers before the fact. It reigns after the fact. It is fueled by caution, dispassion, endless reconsideration, wordy objectivity. Yeah, very wordy. Utilitarians shift their positions, opinions, judgments, prescriptions, according to and depending upon perceived circumstances. The overwhelming characteristics that emerge from their scrupulous debates, Jeremy Bentham versus John Stuart Mill versus Henry Sidgwick versus G.E. Moore versus Charity Bentham, was not that these were extraordinarily pragmatic people. They did not want an ethical example that stood apart from history, as they said did Judaism, Catholicism, Marxism. They wanted a system that adapted with history, come what may. So this is much too long, too complicated. And the author could not restrain from also adding one thing after another. Caution, dispassion, endless reconsideration, wordy objectivity, or they shift their positions, opinions, judgments, propositions, blah, blah, blah. It's tedious. Okay, so what on earth is this doing here? 15 pages of that sort. I'm not afraid of philosophical textbooks, but in a novel, it's just too much. It doesn't work. So for me, the breaking point, the point to decide to DNF this book when it was reached when the local political intrigues of the small settlers community on the island of South Georgia in the Arctic Ocean were described over what felt to me like 100 pages. It reads as dull as the minutes of a town council meeting from 1953. Countless names of people, of families, of clans are mentioned. Scandals and crimes are listed in endless succession without telling or showing the reader how are these groups connected, who represents which interests, what coalitions and animosities exist, what outrage or social scandal was triggered by what or carried out with what intention, what does all this mean for the plot. Nothing of that, just endless succession of names and events that are not at all explained or justified. And the bad thing is that the first person narrator is fully aware that he's telling the story in an unbalanced, incoherent way. Of course, you can use this as a stylistic device, this sort of unreliable narrator who is aware of his unreliability. This can be a very fascinating feature of a novel, but you have to do it carefully, and you cannot use this for dozens or hundreds of pages without ever trying to clarify things or explain things. So I think it's just not good writing style to torture the reader on dozens or even hundreds of pages with this long, incomplete description of unexplained events and mysteries that are never resolved. A small example. I also admit that I might have jumbled the details leading up to the school fire, yes, and I have left out or forgotten much of consequence, such as the turns of the Lindfors, the Harrers, the Roses, the Mooks, the Johansons, and the Beastie family who ruled the camp, the Zulemas, the enslavement, the stoning, the suicides, the stillbirths, as theft from the volunteers' fort at the lighthouse on the inlet point that I have not noted, and the Hospitaler's defamation of Germanicus. They are a sad chronology. So this is a nice example. Again, this endless succession of listing of names, of events. None of the 6 family names that are thrown around here were mentioned before in the dozens of pages of the description of the settler colony. No, were any of the events, other than the burning of the school, reported early, and it's not explained later on. So this is just unnecessary, superfluous, tedious. Okay, that should be enough for now. Let's move on to the second part of the video. A few healing words. And so what are the strengths of the novel, and what interesting thoughts and quotes did I take away with me from reading the novel? As I mentioned, the beginning of the novel is quite original and promising. So this first-person narrator, Grim Fiddle, tells us the story of his own conception and his youth. The story of the conception goes like this. His mother, Lamba Fiddle, is the, I think, 17-year-old daughter of a choleric Lutheran priest called Mort Fiddle, who is prone to violence and drunkenness, like Captain Haddock in the Tintin comics. And Lamba, however, is anything but pious. She's a kind of a seer, or a sorceress, a witch of Nordic mythology. And this Lamba, in sort of an erotic frenzy, she literally assaults an American War Service refugee, Peregrine. She assaults him in a foreigner's pub called the Mickey Mouse Club in Stockholm, Sweden. And it's not totally clear whether this is only erotic seduction or actually close to a rape, what Lamba does here with this Yankee. So the fact is that there there's a quite lively sex scene involved here, and the first person narrator, Grim Fiddle, is conceived in a telephone booth in this pub, and then he grows up not with his mother but with his father Peregrine and his American friends, who are all young men, mainly ice hockey players, who have fled to Sweden to avoid being drafted for the Vietnam War. A very illustrious group, among them also a gay couple. And so this group of men, they earn their living by running a vacation camp for young people where they imitate life as the Vikings, or Vikings, I think it's pronounced in English. Okay. And then through various entanglements, the first person narrator's father, this Peregrine, this refugee who wants to flee the drafting for the Vietnam War, he meets his unfaithful American childhood sweetheart, Charity Bentham. He meets her again by chance because she is now married. She is a successful academic, and she is invited to Stockholm to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. And unfortunately, Charity has brought her husband with her, whom Peregrine, in a fit of jealousy, kills in a very brutal way. He strangles him to death. And this scandal surrounding this murder carried out by a political refugee is just the final spark that makes the political system in Sweden explode, because there had been so many political tensions. So there is a revolt, a political chaos, a whole series of entanglements. And also the grandfather of Grim Fiddle, this choleric, drunken Lutheran pastor, is involved, and he's playing a sort of a demagogue here. And but the brilliant point is, the brilliant end point is that the whole troupe goes on the run. And the whole troop means the first person narrator, Grim Fiddle, his American tutors, his father Peregrine, who has been freed from prison by cunning and violence, and also the widow Charity, who, despite Peregrine has murdered her husband, she has somehow rediscovered her new emotional attachment to her childhood sweetheart Peregrine. And so they go on the run under the leadership of grandfather Mort Fiddle, this Lutheran pastor, this Captain Haddock type, and on his sailing ship with the sweet, promising name Angel of Death. So this is a pretty crazy start, a very promising start. This ship of fools with programmatic names like Peregrine, Charity, Israel. They are murderers, fugitives, despots, philosophers, religious zealots, and they are on the run on a ship called the Angel of Death. So that's stuff you could certainly make a gripping novel out of. But this is beyond the abilities of the author, unfortunately. So, and I have the suspicion that those people who recommend the novel so warmly, I have the suspicion that they only read this beginning, this promising beginning, and they have been fooled by it, because soon after this promising start, the quality of the novel really declines, and in my opinion, it becomes unreal. However, as promised, here is, so the second part of the video, a small selection of interesting thoughts and motifs and quotes that I take with me as a compensation for for the pain of reading 3/4 of the novel. Yeah. First, I mentioned that the tumultuous scene of Peregrine's surprise, of his conception, and of his surprising of the conception of Grimfiddle, and the liberation of Peregrine and the escape on the Angel of Death, they trigger some interesting reflection on how one can suddenly fall out of all the securities of life without being able to explain exactly why, how, and when it happened, or when it all began. And this is well reflected also on a meta level in the novel. So I think this is a very beautiful description of a basic human experience of a surprising existential life crisis that some people can have. Anyone who has been through this sort of existential crisis knows very well how these questions pop up. How did I get here? When and where did this start? Why didn't I see this coming? Why me? Where did I take the wrong turn in my life without realizing it? And what should I do now? So, and it also describes very credibly and realistically how then, in such a situation, these images and thoughts of fear, hallucinations, panic, and all these nightmarishly distorted images of reality, they can dominate your thoughts in such situations. So these images and fears that do not arise from reality and rational thinking, but from just an excessive anxiety and the survival mode of our ancient brain taking control. So this is very well described. And then there's also a nice description of the seductive power of the promises of salvation made by self-proclaimed prophets. And it is really nicely described how these Pied Pipers can exploit such fear-dominated situations or uncertainty-dominated situations in order to gain power over their fellow human beings. And there's one certainly controversial idea here outlined, that the idea that crime, or as it's called here in more theological language, sin, can also be seen as something necessary, a necessary transition phase, necessary from the pedagogical point of view, so to say. So good can also come from evil. So I think it's a difficult argument, a controversial one, but one that is worth to be addressed and to be pondered over. Oh, there are sometimes nice and entertaining pinpricks or pot shots in the direction of certain types of religion. And they, on the one hand, they can seem bitingly spiteful, but I think they're also so apt that they contain a kernel of truth, also worth to be considered also by people who are religious. Like, quotes like, religious education means replacing reason with routine. Okay, and despite all the cruelty, some aspects of a positive view of humanity also flash up again and again, inviting the reader to take a more relaxed and conciliatory approach to political dissidents or ideological enemies. And it's a warning against discrediting people that you disagree with, or discrediting them as enemies. So there are nice statements that, like, they are wrong, but they are not crazy. This person is not your enemy; he is just mistaken. So it's a nice point of view on how to deal in a more mature way with people that you disagree with. However, in general, I found very alarming that in particular, as the novel progresses, this becomes more evident that the very negative, pessimistic view of people, of humankind, of humanity, and of the future, that really creeps into the novel later on. It's also pervaded by a strong fatalism that I do not appreciate very much. So statements like, "What happens once, rise or fall, happens worth when it's repeated." So as if there's some automatism at work that also makes things always worse. So it also remains very unclear what moral position the first-person narrator and the author take. On the one hand, utilitarianism is described in great detail and also is described in a positive way in all its strengths. And I think the ship, the society on the ship, the Angel of Death, and also the later settler colonies, they are described like a community governed according to utilitarian principle. But then this turns into heinous cruelty and excesses of violence, mass executions, body snatching, desecration of corpses, to the point where even the first-person narrator, Grim Fiddle, is disgusted with himself and becomes afraid of himself and his negative change. So, and all what happened here is really contradictory to the basic principles of utilitarianism. So to produce results to the highest level of happiness for the highest number of people, individuals. So there's some contradiction here. So those were a few more detailed reading impressions to soften this review a bit, but also to provide some more substance for my argument that I think this is a weak novel and I would not a novel that I would not recommend. So okay, yeah. So why did I do this hatchet job? Because as I mentioned, I originally intended when I started my channel not to publish any purely negative reviews on this channel, because I prefer to spend my lifetime and also the lifetime of my viewers talking about books that I think are worth reading and worth being talked about. But yeah, in this context of this series about this Pringle list, I think there's no other way. So we have committed to present all of these books, and so I also, of course, have to make a review video about the books that I don't like at all. But I still take the liberty of DNFing such books because I want to spend my precious lifetime in a more sensible way. Okay, that's it for today. The next video in this series will go online, I think, on the 25th of April. So as usual, the rule is always on the last Friday of each month. And then we will talk about the novel by Michael Bishop. And the title is No Enemy But Time. So I hope that this will be a more satisfying read, and hope to see you next time. And until then, have a great reading time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.